Okay, that's something I've been trying to do for months and just keep forgetting. Is this concept of genderizing, I don't think that's a word, but I'll roll with it anyway, things like dresses and high heels. Because the reality of this situation is there was a time when dresses and skirts and things like that were worn by men across the world, not just in, I mean, we've all known, especially here in England, that like the Scots wore kilts. It's always been a thing because they used to wear them in battle. It used to terrify us. I mean, who wouldn't? I mean, let's face it. 1,000 Scots in kilts flying at us. I mean, seriously, any soldier would be terrified. Scary, you know. But it's this concept that across the world there was a time where all men wore things like dresses and skirts. I mean, they weren't called dresses and skirts across the entire world. They all had different names. And heels in themselves were designed for men. And the fact that we get to like the 20th century and we get to the 21st century and we're now in like 2025 and men are openly penalising other men or boys or children and all for wanting to wear heels or dresses or skirts, it's kind of amusing and really, really sad, considering heels were designed for boys and for men to wear in the first place, and dresses and skirts were something that men used to wear and have been wearing for centuries, for millennia. There's no rhyme or reason behind why men are so insecure in themselves that they feel the need to penalise others. I suppose there is the concept that they are so insecure in themselves that they need to penalise others for wearing them. You know, but every time I hear another man or another male criticising other men or other genders, I suppose in this day and age they might not just be men, there may be other genders. Sorry, my mistake, they might be other genders in this day and age, wearing heels, wearing dresses. But it's also the fact that they penalise other boys. I've seen it. You know, when a parent allows their child to wear heels and walk around in dress up, you know, wearing dress up, dressing up in, you know, princess clothes and putting on heels and makeup. Did you know there was a time where makeup was worn by men? It's an odd concept, but it was. Especially here, not just here in England, because it was more by men in England. Especially in the 17th century. I mean, the Georgians wore it. You know, the Georgians wore makeup. Georgian men wore makeup. We are all well aware of this. You know, but out in the Far East, men wore makeup. In places like Egypt, and you know, men wore makeup. They did. You know, it's not a new concept to us. And yet, for some bizarre reason, in this day and age, if a male child puts on a princess dress and a pair of heels and wants to wear makeup and play with dollies, we as adults have a massive hissy fit. Why? Because we have genderized these things as female, when the reality is there was a time when, okay, the doll thing was more female, but the rest of it, nah, it never was. Dresses, makeup, heels especially, were for both, and heels started as a male thing completely. So back in like ancient Egypt, men wore things like kaftans. I think it was a kaftan. Give me a second. Yeah. You get to the ancient Egypt, they wore, because their climate was so hot, they never wore things that were, you didn't sew their clothes. They wore something called a kaftan, and it draped over them, and they pinned it and then put a belt around it. And they weren't the only ones. They also wore things like loincloths. It sounds really tacky. They wore a loincloth a bit like Tarzan, but they did. They wore a wrap, a gauzy type of wrap. Now, we have seen them on films and things like that where they've been in just sort of these wraps or these loincloths. It is true, they did wear them, And of course, as the centuries went by, they actually started, as like the Ptolemaic era went in, they were influenced by the Greeks and the Romans and started wearing togas. They became quite prominent, and they actually started just because they were light and they were airy and they could be quite free in them. It was very kind of easy for them to wear, and they were usually made of linen right up until, I need to change the paper. Yeah. Now, the thing about this is that they needed to, because their clothing was so simple, they had to change the way it looked depending on their status. So back in the time when they were just wearing kaftans, because it was such a simple way of dressing, if they came from status, especially royal line, they would wear a leather garter, sort of a leather belt, or an apron. They'd wear these aprons. Now, we have seen them on films as well, but they were real. They actually found one of, I think it was Ramesses. It was this intricately woven belt. Would have taken months to actually make this thing. Brightly coloured, that he would have worn around the kaftan, around his middle, and an apron that would have been either made of beads or leather and would have had these pleats in it. Now, these would have symbolised status. They are always highly decorated. They were always very elaborate. And they were a symbol of pure status. The more decorated, more highly, but when the 2nd century kind of kicked in and we got more things like tunics and things like that, we get things more like, they brought in things like wool, so they weren't just wearing cotton, they weren't wearing linen anymore, it was wool. Wool became very popular. The Romans and the Greek influence came in. Now, Romans and Greeks, they both wore very similar styles of clothing. They both wore kind of tunics, which were just sheets basically draped over them, pinned at the shoulders, and belts across the middle, and just wrapped around the middle. Depending on if you were male or female, women wore them down to their feet because they had to have their feet covered, so they wore them straight to the floor. And men, cut to the knees. But unless they were of status, and then it was like full length, just covers their feet, covers their legs. But this idea, but what the Egyptians did when they started wearing these tunics is that if they were of status, to symbolise that they were of status, then men would either go around with either sandals on or with no shoes on. And wool was very popular there, but it wasn't always wool. Obviously, the linen ones were still very, very useful over there, but wool was becoming more popular. And you found that wool was cheaper. Very strange over there, but yeah, wool was used by the lower classes. So, yeah, When we get to sort of medieval Egypt, they were beginning to get silk as well. So they would wear silk tunics. And then you got to things, and that's when everything changed, because that's when they started introducing trousers and the turbans. But that is when everything changed. It wasn't until the Middle Ages in Egypt that that men started wearing trousers. Before then, it was skirts, it was dresses, it was these tunics, and they were either made of linen or wool. Right from ancient Egypt right up until the Middle Ages. So, and same was said for, in fact, right up until wherever you actually saw, you know, the ancient Greeks did the same thing. You know, the ancient Greeks didn't start off wearing tunics though. They started off wearing chitons, chiton. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. It's just a rectangular piece of cloth draped on them. And it literally was draped on them. They literally just draped this rectangular piece of cloth over their bodies. They pinned it either side of their shoulders and put a belt around them. Women had to have the feet covered because that was the rule. You know, modesty. Men, cut it off at the knees. That's it. That's all they did. That is how they dressed. It was a very simple, very easy way of dressing. The only difference between the classes in Greece, was the fabric used. In ancient Egypt, wool wasn't introduced until the Romans turned up. So they were all wearing linen. It was just dependent on status, depending on how they were decorated. In ancient Egypt, the lower classes were just wearing plain clothes. There was nothing decorated about them. Whereas the higher classes, the people of status, wore these very decorated, very beautiful kind of clothes. Whereas in ancient Greece and in ancient Rome, because they both wore the same clothing, it's very interesting when you compare the two. They actually wore the same things. They both wore these chitons. They both wore them. And they both wore them around the same periods of time, and their clothing changed around the same period of time. It didn't change much, but it both changed. And it was both very, very simple. And the only thing that was different about them, depending on their status, depending on the fabric, if you were of a higher status, you wore linen. If you were of a low status, you wore wool. And it was that simple. And then they had these, and to make sure they stayed warm, the climates were a little different in Greece and Rome than they were in ancient Egypt. So if they got cold, they also had these cloaks that they wore that they literally did pin. And it's called a himmaton, Himaton. They could pin it to the clock, to the thing, and that's what they did. And they continued to do that, and it just kept them warm. And they can change. That's all they did. That is what they did until they started wearing togas. And togas actually didn't change at all. It didn't change anything really, except for the style in which they wore it. And that's where you see a slight difference in class systems, because not only did you see the wool and the linen, but the length. Obviously, we all know what togas look like, but you've got the lower class who wore the wool. You've got the higher classes which wore the linens, and then you have men of importance. So the reason we see things like Julius Caesar or the men of the Senate wearing these really long togas that sort of covered their legs is because they actually did. Men of importance actually wore full-length togas. So if you were of a higher class, you wore a toga to your knees. It would be made of linen, and that's fine. But if you were a man of importance, like a member of the Senate, your toga would go straight down to your feet. It wouldn't cover your feet, but it would go down to your feet because you were a man and you could have your feet uncovered. Women, however, could not. Their feet had to always be covered because modesty. It wasn't so important in Greece. In Greece, they wore the togas. Greece wore the togas the same time as the Romans did. And they wore them in the same kind of styles as well. And you'll see the same kind of system in place. But they weren't so fussed about everything. You find that men wore these togas in Greece, but they all wore the long ones, and it wasn't such a big deal. They either wore the short ones or the long ones. But it wasn't such a, not like Rome, where it was very structured. You know, the lower class wore wool, the middle class wore the linen, and if you were of importance, you wore the full-length ones to cover your legs. You know, but all women had to wear them. They had to cover their feet because modesty. And the same with Greece, they had to cover their feet, so it would be floor length. You know, both societies worked very similarly. You know, and it's the same, funnily enough, I checked out their armies as well. The Egyptian armies, really difficult to understand how their armies worked, like dress-wise. They wore the skirts. The Egyptian army wore the skirts, but they had breastplates and cloaks. And when I was trying to find their actual battle armor, really, really complicated. Whereas in ancient Greece, you had the Greek army and the Spartan army. Now, those wore very similar things. Their actual army dress, they wore the chitons, I don't know, the chitons, and they had the sandals, and they had their spears or their knives, and their helmets, and the breastplates. If they were in full battle gear, just like the Romans in full battle gear, they wore a skirt, and it was made out of leather and linen, and it was pleated, and it was called a Pturuges. Oh God, it's spelled Pturuges. And both the Greek and the Roman army wore them. But Spartans when they were in battle gear, they did not wear these ones. They wore something called a skellis, which is skellis. It's a belted skirt. It's a short belted skirt, as well as the breastplates and the full, the helmets. So the fact is, and that is just in the east of the world. I found that when I was looking into like India and places like that, we all know, their dress hasn't changed much. Men wear the trousers under the skirts, and their dress hasn't changed. Men's dress has not changed in India at all. It hasn't. So there's nothing different over there. But in Europe, ours has. Now, the thing is, When here in the Western world, we turn around and say, oh, we should not be wearing skirts, blah, 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 it's not a male thing. Actually, it was. Did you know that back in the day, people like Henry VIII were wearing skirts? You know, when we look back at our history, and really go back into our history, men were wearing skirts. Yeah, they were. I mean, they had on, you know, these really puffed things, but they had skirts on. And they actually did call them skirts. It was called a jerkin. People like Henry VIII, for people of importance, wore a jerkin. It's a knee-length skirt. It was low cut. It was low cut. And what they did is they wore a low cut thing. So it's almost like, do you remember those, we've seen them, so those front cutouts of shirts. So it's just that front cutout of a shirt, and then you wear that sort of thing that goes around it to make it look like you're wearing a shirt. And then at the bottom, you've got this skirt at the bottom. So you have a skirt at the bottom, then you've got like the bits that connect the skirt. So you're wearing like this full length sleeve, and then you put that on, and you've got the skirt attached to it. But then you can wear like a front bit. It's almost like putting on the front of a shirt. I think it's the only way I can explain it, and that's like the only way I can explain a jerkin. So you leave like your chest bare. Once you've got this thing on, your chest is bare, and then you like put on the front bit at the end. You know, I'm going to put my shirt bit on now. You know, pretty much the only way I can explain a jerkin. You know, and they wore stockings or hose. They call them hose. Hose is called hose. You know, or stockings, and they wore them, and they were knee length, so they would just sort of go to there. And obviously they'd have these big puffy things on as well. But that is what the upper classes and royalty wore. They wore them. They wore stockings and skirts. All right. If they were of the lower class, they wore what would have been classed as a cot. That would have been a full length. So pretty much what I've got on. Obviously, there would be nothing. Obviously, you know, it wouldn't. There'd be nothing showing. Obviously, it'd be like a dress. You know, a proper dress. You know, it'd almost be like a dress for boys. And that's exactly what it was. Only the sleeves would be puffy, and everything would be sort of over the top. But it would be almost like a dress for boys. It's a cot. It's a long sleeve, tight waist, knee-length skirt. That is how it was. That is how it was described. It is described as a long-sleeved, tight waist, knee-length skirt, and it's one piece. So it is a dress for boys. Dress for men is actually a dress for men. It is designed for the lower class. It is a dress for men, and then they would put on their hose, which were knee-length. So men actually did wear. Not only did they wear like dresses, they actually wore these. They wore dresses. The upper class wore skirts. The lower class wore dresses. Here in the Western world. On top of that, they wore stockings and hosés. Because when they did away with the hosé, they started wearing stocking and garter belts. Yeah, well no, not the garter belts. They started wearing stockings and garters. Yeah, they were, and they did. And then, so I mean, and they did that right up until, I mean, and on top of all of that, children were all dressed in skirts, even boys. Right up until the 19th century, when it was becoming more and more fashionable to put children to dress in trousers. And then by the end of the 19th century, boys were by the middle of the 19th century, they were beginning to put boys, like children, young boys, in trousers as well. It was becoming, you know, it got to sort of the middle of the 19th century when children were being differentiated and they were beginning to put young boys into trousers rather than keeping them in dresses and skirts, you know, actually allowing them to be boys and put them into trousers as well. You know, so dressing boys and girls in their respective clothing, you know, boys in trousers, girls in dresses, it's only been going since like the mid 19th century. So it's only been what, a century and a half? Like a couple of centuries since this has been going on? Mid 19th century, so what, about 2 centuries we've been doing this? Century and a half, I don't know. Mid 19th century since this has been going on. It's not been happening for hundreds of thousands of years. Boys have been in dresses and skirts for centuries. Boys have been wearing dresses and skirts for centuries. It's only been since the mid 19th century that men have been wearing trousers, especially here in the Western world. And in the Eastern world, that's where it differentiates, because in the Eastern world, they've been wearing, you know, trousers a lot longer, but they're different types of trousers because they've got to be for their weather. You know, so they're lightweight and they're linen and they're breathable. You know, they're not the same. You know, and you just set this concept that actually here in the Western world, boys wearing trousers is not something that we've been doing for a long time. It's something that's fairly new concept for us in a respective of time, considering that for thousands of years, that for a millennia, we were in dresses and skirts. Thousands of years. We were in dresses and skirts. Men were in dresses and skirts for hundreds and thousands of years. We were not in, because the Anglo-Saxons wore skirts and dresses, the Vikings wore skirts and dresses. They all wore tunics. The Vikings, they all wore tunics, they wore battle dresses. If you take a look at the Viking culture, they wore battle dress, they wore tunics, they wore things like that. They did not wear trousers. You know, the people that actually created our culture wore skirts and dresses here in England, that created our culture. Yeah, so for hundreds of thousands of years, for a millennia, we have been wearing, men have been wearing, boys have been wearing skirts and dresses. Since the mid 19th century, they have been wearing trousers. It's a new concept for us, not a 1,000-year concept for us. So the next time you hear somebody have a go at anyone, any male, any other gender, for wearing dresses or skirts, or any parent having a go at anybody else for allowing their male child, for wearing dresses or skirts, or yelling at a child for wanting to dress up in dresses and skirts, say something, because quite frankly, it's not new. Boys have been wearing them for millennia. It's inbuilt in them, I think. There's nothing wrong with it. Doesn't make them gay, doesn't make them transgender, doesn't make them any other gender. If they want to be another gender, they can be another gender. It doesn't do anything to them, doesn't make them any less a human being. It's actually innate. They've been wearing them for millennia. Doesn't change the fact that when they grow up they want to wear trousers. Doesn't change the fact that when they dress up, when they grow up, they might want to wear a dress. It's not going to change who they are as a person. Wearing trousers or wearing dresses as a child is not going to change who they turn out to be as an adult. But actually, they've been wearing them for millennia. So what's the difference now? Yeah. I think it's ridiculous, but I did want to look into it because it's beginning to get on my nerves, listening to people yell and scream at other people for wearing them, when actually, here in England, we've been wearing them for a long time. And the same goes for makeup. Yelling and screaming at a male or whatever for wanting to wear makeup, or saying anything about boys not wearing makeup, saying that it's wrong for boys to wear makeup, when actually, here in England, the Georgian era especially, boys and men wore makeup. They did. It was natural. You know, we all did it. It was a normal thing to do. It was a societal thing to do. It was actually a fashionable thing for males to do. But in ancient Egypt, it wasn't a fashionable thing to do. It was the right thing to do. It was something they all did because it was a sign of status over there. In ancient Egypt, wearing makeup was a sign of status. The pharaohs wore it. People of high class wore it. You wore the makeup in certain ways to prove that you were of high status, to show that you were regal, you were royal. It was part of their societies, how they showed off. You know, it wasn't just like here in England where it was a fashion statement. It also, like here in England, it wasn't, you know, they used it to hide things like smallpox scars and things like that. Over there, it was a status thing. Over here, it was we're going to hide all our smallpox scars and we're going to hide in blemishes, and, you know, it became a fashion thing and you know, we're going to hide any imperfections with this very poisonous makeup. You know, here it was fashion, over there it was a statement. You know, makeup was always worn by both genders. So again, it's nothing new for boys to want to wear makeup. My son loves it. When my son was little, I put makeup on him. He liked it. And now he likes to get his nails done, although he doesn't like people knowing that. After the fire, I had to buy a whole new nail set. I'm not a big fan of getting my nails done, but I had to buy a whole new nail set for him because he lost his. He likes having his nails done. It's so sweet. It's actually kind of nice. I got a boy who likes having his nail done. My sister, who is a beautician, has 2 daughters who like having their hair done and looking pretty in their hair, but my sister, who trained as a beautician, has 2 daughters who are not that fussed about getting their, you know, makeup and their nails looking pretty. My son loves it. Not so much the makeup, because he's got like eczema and psoriasis and stuff, but he loves having his nails done. Gets his nails done every like month or so. It's really kind of cool. When we were at the house, he had them done so they looked like his switch. So he had blue on one side and red on the other. It was kind of cool. But yeah, so he loves it. He loves getting his nails done. He thinks it's really cool. But yeah, it was really cool. They sit there and do his nails. But there is nothing wrong with it, and I think it's really kind of cool when they get it done because they look really just funny. But he doesn't like a lot of people know him because he thinks he's going to get bullied for it. You know, but I think it's really sweet. But again, when it comes to things like that, there's nothing wrong with it, and actually it kind of is designed for both. It's designed for everybody. It's not a one gender thing. It never has been. Because there was a time when men wore it and were not ashamed to wear it. They openly wore it. It was part of our world. It was part of life. Everybody knew that men wore it and never actually had an issue with it. Now, one thing that when I was looking into, now I always knew that heels were designed for men because that is something I've always known. But I always thought it started in France with Louis XIV. It actually didn't. It actually started in the 10th century with Persia. Now that was something I really didn't know. And it started with the Persian cavalry. In the 10th century, the Persian cavalry, they wore the heels to keep their feet in their stirrups, so that when they were in battle, they could keep themselves stable on their horse while they're shooting arrows at the enemy. That is actually genius. That was actually pretty genius. That's actually genius. I mean, you couldn't get better than that. I mean, it actually keeps you really secure on the horse, while you sort of just shoot your enemy. Ha! That's so cool. I mean, obviously it wasn't cool for the enemy, but that's actually really cool. Now, but the news of what the Persians did spread really quickly amongst their neighbours. Especially once the trade and other cultures started sort of really to open up, or the trade routes and the culture route kind of really opened up. The popularity of having heels really started to spread, and once it spread to Europe, it really took root amongst the upper classes and the aristocracy especially, who adopted the heeled shoes or riding shoes, or they were actually given the name the Louis shoes because Louis XIV loved them. They became an absolute symbol of wealth and prosperity, especially in France. And by the 17th century, they had spread throughout Europe. Especially, they were here in England. They were everywhere. A lot, and the upper classes, the aristocracy throughout, not just over in Europe, but here in England as well, had heeled shoes. They loved them. They made them, obviously it gave them height. It made them look more regal, more aristocratic. It was actually a very nice sort of symbolised thing of power. And it actually became a height of fashion. And Louis XIV actually really did adopt this. He was very, very famous for it, and he became quite famous for them. Hence why he got this title of Louis Heels. He had this set, it was because of him specifically that they really did take root in this symbol of aristocracy and the symbol of power, wealth and status. He really did adopt them, but it didn't last long. Wearing them as this symbol of whatever, this just didn't last long because they found them uncomfortable, difficult to walk in. They got to a point when the newness of them, the fashion statement, the whole concept of them began to wear thin. And it just died down. The hype was over, the fashion statement had been made. And a lot like all the other fashions of the world, we all know how they go. Fashion rises and it falls. And they did fall amongst the men. They hyped them up, they really did, and they built them up to be something so incredible. And the whole of the aristocracy they wore them, and they wore them with pride until they realised that they hurt their feet, they were uncomfortable to wear, they weren't what they wanted, and they stopped wearing them so often. They weren't using them as they really stopped wearing them, started going to other things, started going back to more comfortable footwear, and the hype died down. And eventually what happened is that the women started wearing them. They actually found them more comfortable. They liked them. It's almost like they coveted them. When the men stopped wearing them, the women did. When their husbands stopped wearing these heeled shoes, the women took over. It's exactly what happened. So the fashion in the men's world just died down, and the women kind of took up the mantle for them. And then we got to the 18th century when Marie Antoinette really did secure this kind of symbol that heels were for women, not for men. You know, she had them specifically made for her. And all of a sudden, they switched sides. All of a sudden, heeled shoes were made for women because all of a sudden women were wearing them more than the men were. And the men just sort of let it happen. They just did. They realised that actually if the women wanted them, they could have them because actually they weren't that comfortable and they didn't really like them anymore. And if they wanted them, they could keep them. So they did. This is exactly what they did, and they just stopped wearing them. You know, so by the 18th century, Marie Antoinette had hyped them up again, but they'd hyped them up for women. And women now took up the mantle and went, okay, heels are now for women. And that's all anybody's ever remembered. That's all anybody's ever remembered. Heels, high heels are made for women. And high heels have been made for women ever since the 18th century, when Marie Antoinette had them specifically made for her. And all of a sudden, they changed. But before then, they were designed specifically for men. So high heels were actually meant for men to wear. So the fact that boys and men actually want to wear them is nothing new, and it's nothing to be ashamed of, and it's nothing to feel weird about. And the fact that little boys want to wear them is nothing weird at all. There's nothing strange about that. And reality-wise, men can usually walk better in them than women can. So I don't really see the point of getting upset about it. And if men want to wear them before, let them, because quite frankly, they hurt our feet. And if men prefer them over women, I don't see the problem. I really don't. And I'll tell you what, if a 3-year-old can walk in them better than I can, I'll let him. Because, yeah. It's a bit like makeup. Tell you what, men can do makeup better than women can. They really can. It's an odd thing to say sometimes, but a man can do makeup way better than any woman can. They're amazing at it. You know, it's actually quite incredible sometimes. Anyway, I'm going to go. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.